Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to show you some critical moments on games when one side is in the middle of an attack and needs to make a serious and important decision. Here is our first example. Black has started an interesting attack on the king's side, even though his own king has castled there as well. The black pawn from g7 has advanced all the way to g4, which naturally is a somewhat risky endeavor. The question is how to continue, because in such situations, if white gains enough time and gets fully developed, oftentimes it will be black who will get in trouble because his king is rather loose, has a lot of weak squares in front of it. Moreover, in this particular case, white is a pawn up. So therefore, black must act very quickly. In this case, it's quite important to look for aggressive moves. When you're down a pawn, and as I said, the king is in a definitely sensitive position, there is no time for quiet moves usually. So let's start with the most natural looking move, trading the knight for the bishop on g3. Although I have to say, at first it seems that if the pawn recaptures, white has a rock-solid position. But sometimes first impressions are deceiving. Capturing back with the king certainly does not look good, and it is not good, because the king would be chased right away. You can kind of smell that this is not good for white. As long as you see the idea that after the pawn black will simply do en passant, you can pretty much stop the calculation before making the knight trade on g3 in our initial position and move on to other scenarios and deal with situations when the pawn captures back instead. Nevertheless, let's see how can black finish up the attack here in this position. Black needs to continue with aggressive moves and getting more pieces into the attack with rook f4. Now there is an obvious checkmate threat on h4. If pawn g3, then queen d7, and rook takes pawn using the pin, bishop d4, and now it's clear that white is losing more material. Let's go back. After f4, en passant, king h3, rook f4. If white plays g4, it's somewhat better. Now the pawn on f3 is hanging. And now that black already won back the pawn, the white king is horrendous. Black has the time to simply protect the pawn on f3 and bring an extra rook to the attack. If now white would try to disconnect the harmony between the two black rooks on the f-file, black would simply capture that, as if pawn takes rook now, then queen takes h4, ends the game with checkmate. Or if instead white makes, for example, a blockading move with rook f2, then black has another elegant combination, rook g4, and it's just so typical that when a king is walking around kind of in the middle of the board, the checkmate always comes sooner or later, just like here, and the queen gives the final check. Let's go back and look at the more challenging line after knight g3, pawn taking back. Now white still maintains the extra pawn, and it seems that a pretty solid position. In fact, it looks like the white king is in a more solid position than black's. And nevertheless, black has an extremely strong move right now. And that move is bishop to e5. This move creates a pin over the g3 pawn And that means that the black queen now threatens to capture the pawn on h4. If the white king would move out of the pin, which is still relatively the best choice, then on the other hand, bishop can capture the pawn and threatening queen h4 and then checkmate on h2. Amazingly, white is pretty helpless against this plan. For example, bishop f5, queen takes, check, king g7, white only gets to give a couple of checks, but ultimately is stuck with the same problems. g3, queen h3, and when the queen moves, bishop g3 with a major advantage for black. So how do we come to the conclusion on how to continue in a situation like this? Well, we need to look for forceful moves in situations when we're having the initiative, we're attacking, and we're down in material. Time is the essence. We don't want to give the opportunity to our opponent to get out of trouble. For example, if this king would be back on h1, white's trouble would be all solved. Because after a trade on g3 and bishop e5, there would be no pin, and white would get the time to simply move the queen to d3 if black would play similarly like we saw in the game. So play energetically when you're attacking. Let's move on to our next example. That's kind of different than the previous one. Here also, white seems to be in the middle of an attack, having the rook on g3 and the pawn on h4 and the knight and the queen. All the white pieces seem to be positioned for the attack. However, black has a pawn on f5, which seems to hold off the attack against the black king for the moment. And in this case, white needs to choose whether to look for aggressive attacking moves, somehow to reposition our pieces or improve the position of our pieces, or rather use the opportunity by methods of tactics of a combination to transform our initiative, our attack, to winning a pawn and into a winning endgame. And here, because of a hidden pin on the f-file, white can have a beautiful sacrifice by capturing on e4, then using the pin and capture the pawn, checking black's king, and capture the queen. Now, of course, if king takes rook, knight takes rook, and white is a knight ahead. So black better captures a knight. Rook captures pawn, rook captures pawn, rook captures with a check, king f4. So after all these clouds were gone, a lot of capturings on both sides, we see that white is a pawn up at the moment. However, in this case, that pawn does not have much of an importance, because the black rooks are very active as well, and black also has a passed pawn on the e-file. Here, the important part is that the white h-pawn will be faster than black's passed pawn. And the reason for it is that the white rooks are positioned a lot better for catching the black pawn than the black rooks are for catching the white pawn. It's important to immediately move the rook out of the way, because otherwise, after the other rook would give a check and king f5, the rook could be hanging on g6. For the moment, the black cannot push the e-pawn forward without losing the pawn after checks from e8. Rook takes pawn, and rook e7 check. King f4, h5, the pawn is running. Rook d1, King h2, rook d5. Black is hoping that if white advancing the pawn, of course, a fork comes with rook h5. But white can do better than that. Rook f7, king e3, rook g3. As we know, rooks are best positioned behind the pawn. King e2 and h6. The point is that after rook h5, the rook can block. Came rook a to a5, g4, and black resigned as the two g and h pawns got connected, and with the help of the white rook on f7, white will win easily. So this was an example to show that even when you're in the middle of attack, constantly look out for opportunities, how and if you have an opportunity to transfer to a more technical or technically winning position in an endgame. Let's go back again and see how the attack can develop further when you already seemingly have all the pieces at its utmost best position. Here we can see the black queen and rook being on the g file, pinning the white's g3 pawn. Also, the black knight is in an ideal square on e4, and the black rook is also helping on f8. Black can hardly do any better. When you see a situation like that, that's a red flag that, well, it must be action time. Or, oftentimes, if there is nothing to precede the attack, it means that maybe our position is just simply not as good as we thought it is. But more often than not, when all the pieces are optimally positioned, and there are especially some other things like a pin involved, like here on the g file, there is something. In this case, you also see the discoordination of the white pieces. One rook on a2 in an unnatural square, another one on h3 defending on the g3 pawn, the knight still on b1 in its initial square. So certainly you can tell that the white pieces are very randomly positioned instead of centralized, doubled on the same file or something like that. It was black's turn, and black played a very fine move, advancing the f-pawn forward, trying to use the pin. In the actual game, in a Dutch championship, white captured the pawn on f4, and after the black rook recaptured on f4, white resigned, realizing that the threat on the f2 pawn is too deadly. After king g1 right now, in addition to capturing on f2, black can do even better by playing knight g5 and then fork on f3. But let's see what would happen if black would play f4 and then white plays differently. For example, let's see knight d2. Trying to trade knights. Typically, when our opponent is attacking, any trade of pieces would be very helpful for the defense. Now, one of those situations when all your pieces are ideally located, look for combinations. Knight f2. If the king captures back, pawn could capture with a double check. So queen captured, pawn captured on g3, queen had to leave again, and the rook comes into f2. King g1 and rook h2, a very fine move. If rook takes, pawn takes, king takes, queen h6, and checkmate. So therefore the only move is to protect the rook by playing queen f1. And now black simply brings the queen to g5, threatening on e3, and white is pretty helpless because if the queen moves protecting the pawn, then the rook would be hanging, and after rook takes rook, the problems are pretty similar as we've seen before. Check on the h file, and now check on f2, followed by checkmate. Let's go back again. After f4, let's see if white plays a move like rook c2, kind of a waiting move. Then black has several good ways. One is to take on g3 right away and then play knight g5, or even more precise maybe to play queen g6 right away, since now the rook is on that same diagonal and the knight threatens with some discovery moves. For example, after knight a3, knight g5, and then queen e4 check if the rook moves away. And otherwise, of course, just take, and now even rook f4. Very nice for black. So this was not a very difficult example, but it shows the power of an attack. Let's move on to our next example, where it's black's turn. And here the first thing to notice is to see that the white pawn on e4 seems to be hanging. However, this is the situation when you do need to calculate. And certainly you do need to be suspicious of your opponent, whether did your opponent blunder that pawn or was it a sacrifice. After knight takes e4, you can see that white can capture several things, not just the knight, but also the bishop on g7. Naturally, the knight first, otherwise the queen would be hanging. And it's not difficult to see that after the trade of the bishops, white will have a fork, winning the black bishop. So the first thing is to establish that capturing the pawn on e4 would be a blunder. By the way, capturing with the bishop wouldn't be any better, because now not knight takes bishop, because the knight takes back attacks the queen, but simply remove the guard by bishop takes knight and then the bishop. So we're back to this position and we need to figure out how may black still gain advantage here. This is a critical moment that if black misses the opportunity, white will have space advantage, the moment will be gone, and white will have a slightly better position. How do you figure out which direction to go in a situation like this? Well, this is one of those situations where it's not so obvious and it's a bit hard to tell. That's why it's important to learn from books or video lessons or online lessons like this one and get ideas. Because in such type of Maroczy bind positions, it's not an uncommon idea to use what we'll see here. Namely, to play e5. Use the moment that the white bishop is on d4 and the pawn on f4, trying to open this diagonal as well as the d file. You'll see the various tactics working out nicely for black. The main idea is that if white would simply grab the pawn, black could trade queens and then play bishop h6, winning an exchange. So this is the main idea. Then, of course, the other idea is that if the white bishop moves, then already black is ready to capture the pawn, and white cannot successfully regain the pawn with queen d6 because black will win again a pawn with bishop b2. The game continued after bishop takes e4 with queen b4. Now white is trying to capture the pawn with the rook. Black played queen e7, and now if rook takes, then takes, and because of the pin that got created, black is able to give a check, and then, among other good moves, bishop c5, giving black a pretty big advantage. Therefore, black remains a pawn ahead, White in the game didn't try to win the pawn back, realizing they couldn't, and played c5. And black simply responded with d5. Rook e1, and now bishop h6. A good move to use the pin, winning a second pawn. The more of these critical positions you look at, listen to, or try to solve, the better chances you'll have to get a sense, A, when is the critical moment, and B, trying to find the correct move when you get the smell that this is the moment to look for something concrete, look for something tactical. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. This is a famous composition by the composer Troitsky. White is a pawn ahead, but with not that many pieces left on the board, and the white king being all out in the open, of course there is a huge danger of perpetual checks or the game ending in a draw. Also, the d5 pawn is under a threefold attack right now. It seems that the white knight is out of play, pretty far out, and there's not much that can be done. Yet amazingly, white can start with a quiet move and force a win. Try to figure out a solution and then listen in if you got it correctly. The move is knight g4. A pretty amazing move which threatens with the white queen to give a check and then force the black king into a position where the white knight can fork the king and the queen. Of course, if queen takes knight right now, white just has a skewer with that same queen move to b4. I suggest you try to figure out one by one the winning moves after the different black queen moves. If after knight g4, black takes the pawn on d5 with the idea that if queen b4 then queen c4 check, then on the other hand the check comes from f2. If the king moves to a c4 or e4, the fork is already there. And if it moves to d3, then queen d2, and again the king is forced either to c4 or e4, and then the fork arrives. What a beautiful endgame. Well, thank you so much for listening, and be back next week and I'll share with you some more chess advice. So long.